Thank you for downloading this episode of the Physicians Gallery podcast. In this series, we explore the history of medicine from A to Z, taking you on a journey from autopsies to zoonosis. Our wide range of topics includes diseases and treatments, plants and chemicals, and myths and curiosities. Please support us and help us to reach new audiences by liking, following, or leaving a comment on whatever podcast platform you are listening on. We hope you enjoy the podcast. Welcome to the Physicians Gallery podcast as we explore the history of medicine from A to Z. My name is Daisy Cunynghame and I am the Physicians Gallery Heritage Manager.
My name's Olivia Howarth and I'm a volunteer with the Physicians Gallery.
And I'm Charlotte Holmes and I'm also a volunteer with Physicians Gallery.
And today we've made it to S. What's your S then, Olivia?
I've gone for scurvy, which is, not really fun, but I'll do my usual trick and start with a bit of etymology. The word scurvy refers to the appearance of the disease, a variant of scurfy from early 15th century English. Suffering from the scurf meant being covered with scaly or flaking skin. The word scurvy also came to mean worthless or contemptible. Shakespeare uses the phrase scurvy politician in King Lear to describe someone as a contemptible schemer. It's also referred to by the medical term scorbutus. Scurvy is a deficiency disease resulting from lack of vitamin C. And that's because the human body can't synthesize vitamin C and has to depend on dietary sources to meet its needs. The body's reserves of vitamin C can be depleted in around 1 to 3 months, and those reserves are affected by lifestyle factors such as smoking, biological conditions such as inflammation, and pathological conditions such as malabsorption. Today, it's known that a lack of dietary vitamin C causes scurvy, but it's worth noting that vitamins weren't discovered until the 20th century.
Greatest hits of scurvy there.
Early symptoms of vitamin C deficiency include weakness, fatigue, sore arms and legs. Not too bad to start with, but over time symptoms worsen. Skin bruises easily, gums bleed, teeth and hair fall out, and old wounds reopen. And without treatment, there can be jaundice, personality changes, seizures, and a decline into lethargy and death from infection or bleeding. Scurvy was first described in 1550 BCE in the ancient Egyptian Ebers papyrus after being reported amongst soldiers and sailors who had minimal access to fruits and vegetables. And the reason scurvy is often culturally linked with seafaring is that historically, scurvy was a limiting factor in long-distance sea travel. During the age of sail, it was common to lose half the crew to scurvy on a lengthy voyage, and it's estimated that the disease killed more than 2 million sailors between the 16th and 18th centuries.
A lot.
It's quite a lot. So now we know that you can prevent scurvy with rich sources of vitamin C like oranges and lemons. So the curative effects of citrus fruit were observed and confirmed by several notable figures. In 1593, Admiral Sir Richard Hawkins advocated drinking orange and lemon juice to prevent scurvy. And in 1614, John Woodall, Surgeon General of the East India Company, published The Surgeon's Mate as a handbook for apprentice surgeons aboard the company's ships. He recommended fresh food, oranges, lemons, limes, and tamarinds to cure and ward off scurvy, but he was unable to explain why that worked. Despite those sort of early attempts to point towards citrus fruit, lack of communication between travellers and between those responsible for their health, as well as the fact that fruits and vegetables couldn't be kept fresh for long on the ships, meant further maritime tragedies were unavoidable, or not avoided anyway. So we have 2 Scottish names to thank for the improvement of sailors' health in Britain, and they are James Lind and Gilbert Blaine. James Lind was a Scottish surgeon in the Royal Navy. In 1747, he carried out one of the first controlled clinical experiments reported in the history of medicine. This randomized clinical trial occurred on board the Royal Navy ship Salisbury. After 2 months at sea, scurvy began to appear amongst the crew, When Lynn had 12 cases to treat, he divided them into pairs. All the men received the same care, food and drink, plus one of 6 possible treatments: cider, elixir vitriol, which is also known as dilute sulfuric acid, vinegar, seawater, paste of plant extracts, or 2 oranges and a lemon each day, which I would take that last one over all the others. The result of the trial was conclusive. Only the pair given citrus fruit made a rapid and immediate recovery. Lind concluded that the results of all my experiments was that oranges and lemons were the most effectual remedies for this distemper at sea. Unfortunately, like many others, Lind was still wedded to the established humour-based view of health and tried to align his findings within that frame of reference. In his work, A Treatise on the Scurvy, published in 1753, he only dedicates a few paragraphs to his experiment, and poor diet is identified as just one of several causes of the condition. He shared medical opinion at the time that scurvy had multiple causes, notably hard work, bad weather, and the consumption of salt meat in a damp atmosphere, which inhibited helpful perspiration and normal excretion, and therefore required multiple solutions. Lynn's ultimate suggestion was to make a concentrated rob of lemon juice by boiling it, but the boiling process destroyed the vitamin C and it was therefore unsuccessful. Although the knowledge that citrus fruits cured scurvy began to spread steadily through the Navy, a clear division of opinion began to form. On the one hand were the sailors and naval surgeons convinced by the evidence of eyewitness. On the other were shore-based administrators and classically trained physicians who dismissed such evidence as anecdotal and failed to conform with any known theory of disease. It took another Scottish physician to enact change. Gilbert Blaine served as a physician to the fleet in 1779, and after considerable experimentation, determined that adding 10% distilled ethyl alcohol to lemon juice would preserve it without destroying its beneficial properties. His successful treatment of the crew during a voyage to the Caribbean led to him being appointed Commissioner of the Sick and Wounded Board, and that meant he could persuade the Admiralty to introduce a daily supplement of lemon juice to a sailor's diet. So from 1795 onward, each Royal Navy sailor was allotted 3/4 of an ounce of lemon juice per day, but that caused its own challenges. In 1804, for example, the Navy Board had to source 50,000 gallons of lemon juice, which would typically have come from Spanish fruit, and Britain was at war with Spain. So as a result, the board switched to lime juice, which could be obtained from British colonies in the Caribbean. And that's why in the War of 1812, US sailors who didn't know or believe in that preventative treatment ridiculed the British as limeys. That's why we're called limeys.
So Charlotte, what's your S?
My S is sympathetic medicine, or sympathetic magic, or sympathetic cures. So what is sympathetic medicine? It's a medicine that is based off of sympathetic magic, which is a type of magic that is based on the idea that someone can be magically affected by an object or action that represents or is connected with them. And this magic is particularly different from other types of magic in that it's supposed to be known. It's not supposed to be occult or hidden. And it's particularly associated with Paracelsus, who I believe we've discussed sort of briefly in the podcast. But I just want to quickly go through some fun biography of him, mostly because his name is amazing. He was born Theophrades Philippus Aurelius Bombastus von Hohenhelm. Excuse me for my terrible pronunciation.
Strong name.
It's a strong name.
That is a good name.
But then he goes by Paracelsus, so, well, pretty strong, but not as strong. He was a Swiss physician and alchemist in the 1500s, and he is sort of spoken about as an opposition to Galenic teaching, which we've definitely talked about. Galenic teaching being those 4 humors that we mention often. But I think it's a bit more, well, I would and other scholars would say it's a bit more complicated than that. Paracelsus did champion new quote-unquote chemical theories, dividing all materials into sulfur, mercury, and salt, and understood them to have hidden powers. This tri-prima, were principles rather than materials. So mercury was spirituousness or volatility, sulfur was inflammability or combustibility, salt was solidity or consistency. So his ideas were quote-unquote chemical, but also mystical. things have these, again, hidden powers that we just need to pry open. As an aside, his most ardent disciple was Joan Baptista van Helmont, who is often credited with the idea of gas. And he believed that all objects were alive in some way. And this was called vitalism. It was a very short-lived belief system, but I think it's really interesting, that sort of idea that anything is alive.
Also terrifying.
Also terrifying. Paracelsus is often credited with the weapon salve, which is probably the most famous sympathetic cure. And here's an example from a recipe book dated from 1709. Take of the rustiest bacon that you can get, 1 pound. It must be singed bacon and dried in a chimney. Put this in a frying pan and let it fry until it is melted. So that's the recipe, but then there's the virtue underneath it. And the virtue can be the sort of efficacy of the treatment, but it sometimes is also a very fancy way of saying this is what you actually do with the recipe. So in this case, the virtue is to take any weapon, be it sword or knife, nail, tool, or instrument, whatever, that has made the wound or cut, dress it with this salve, which you do thus. Just melt some of it and dip a feather in it, and there, with dressing it upwards, and wrap it up in a clean cloth and set it by with a point or edge upwards. So essentially, you are taking the bacon and putting it on the weapon, or the weapon that caused the wound, and by putting that salve on the weapon, you are curing the wound.
I'm just looking at Olivia's face during that.
Well, I thought that's what you were saying, but also it's so bizarre, and I'm confused by the concept of rusty bacon.
Yeah, I don't know why. I think that just refers to the color. So, like, they want it to be like the reddest bacon. But yeah, I don't really know why it's called the rustiest. I love recipes. I'm so sorry. I always bring them. Just like, look at how cool they are.
Brilliant.
Another recipe from this same collection includes much less savory ingredients, including, quote, the moss of a man's skull who was hanged or who died of a violent death, end quote. This is actually a typical ingredient in weapon salves, which could also use mummies as an ingredient. The rustiest bacon is actually quite a tame recipe. But importantly, the wound could be cured sympathetically through the connection between the wound and the weapon that caused it. Some scholars have actually suggested that this appeared to work because it simply left the wound alone rather than subject it to 16th and 17th century cures, which in my very non-medical opinion seems like a good explanation, considering the ingredients that some of these things had. With a modern lens, sympathetic cures feel like folk magic, and perhaps they were at one point and appropriated by Paracelsus and his followers. Here's another example of a sympathetic cure from the 1709 recipe book, and this is for the gout. Bore a hole with a proper instrument in a growing oak tree till you reach the heart or pith of it, 3 days before the new moon, and apply it to the place affected, what the instrument brings out, and keep it on for 3 days. Then mix it with some of the patient's hair and the parings of nails of his fingers and toes. Put them all in together into the hole you made in the oak, and stop it up close with a pin made of the wood of the same tree. Very magical, very folk magic. And I think this cure is supposed to associate the oak with the medical issue, because part of the oak is being applied to wherever the gout is affecting your body. And then the hair and the nails are sort of that conduit for the disease to just be put into the oak, I think is why it works that way. One to ponder, because I don't really understand how the oak would otherwise be connected with your gout. But this recipe in particular is doubly interesting for me, at least, because hair and nails feature prominently in accusations of witchcraft in Scotland. For example, in John Dougal's accusations in 1700, he was accused of trying to cure convulsion fits by taking the nail clippings and eyebrow hairs from the diseased and tying them, quote, in a clute and casting it from him on the high road to the old kirk of Inverkip. Unfortunately, the charm didn't work. Basically, the charm was supposed to cast away the disease, but if the charm was found, it would be transferred to the finder. So you definitely didn't want to be the person that found this clute, this piece of cloth, on the way to church, which seems like the worst time to find a piece of magic. So I think going back to that oak tree recipe, if we stopper the clippings and things into the oak, that means nobody else will get hurt, potentially. So there's a nice thing to think about. In the 1620s and 30s, sympathetic cures were controversial for this exact reason. They sound like folk magic. Robert Flood, an English physician and known character, defended the salve in one of his Latin works printed in 1623. It was included in a 3-page digression. I can't remember exactly what the Latin work was on, but he digresses for 3 pages talking about the mystical properties of blood. And in this, he talks about sympathetic medicine and particularly the weapon salve. And this began a printed row across the water, with several pamphlets going back and forth between Flood and French national philosophers who thought it was superstitious and demonic magic. In 1631, in the middle of the feud, a pamphlet entitled Hoplochrysma Spanus, or a sponge to wipe away the weapon salve, which I included because I thought it was really funny, decried the extensive use of the weapon salve in Britain. And Flood responded to this, arguing that it worked by natural, definitely natural, not demonic powers. And finally, the sort of nail in the coffin was a German philosopher, Daniel Sennert, who waded into the argument and concluded it wasn't really effective anyway, so why are we talking about it? And this controversy arguably leads to the decline of sympathetic cures, particularly this weapon salve, particularly in the medical professional spheres, until the 1650s, when another fun name, Sir Kenelm Digby, revived it with his pamphlet, which was printed in 1658. He provides a recipe for sympathetic powder, which he supposedly used to cure King James VI and first and his son Charles. And this pamphlet served to advertise Digby's intellectual property, but also his loyalty to the Stuarts during the interregnum, that period between Stuart monarchs. So as indicated by their presence in the recipe book that I mentioned earlier, sympathetic medicine continued into the 18th century, but perhaps through a combination of the decline of magical belief, the rise of germ theory, and the acknowledgement of their limited efficacy, sympathetic medicine had died out by sort of the 19th century. And music.
So my S is snuff. So snuff is tobacco powder. So it's ground up tobacco, which you inhale. And its first arrival in Europe is when it's brought back from South America by Spanish invaders in the 15th century. And it's quite a slow process for snuff to make its way around Europe. So first arrives in Spain, then it moves to France, then it moves to Scotland. So it skips England. And that is because of the close connection between Scotland and France at that time. So it ends up coming to England about 100 years later. And it becomes popular in royal circles quite quickly. So snuff is a very high status drug for quite a long time. If you were poorer, you would smoke your tobacco, and if you were well off, you would take it as snuff. And you can tell this by the number of very fancy objects that go along with snuff taking. So very, very quickly after snuff arrives, you start getting, diamond encrusted snuff boxes, made of gold and covered in jewels. And you get snuff spoons as well, which look, if you have ever seen in pop culture a cocaine spoon, tiny little spoon, that is the modern version, but it's a tiny little spoon for snuff taking. And again, these were, encrusted with jewels and things. And their purpose was really to make sure that you didn't end up with stained fingers, because if you took snuff by pinching it with your fingers, you would end up with very, very stained fingers. In the early days of snuff, it was very DIY. So you would take a bundle of tobacco with you in a special box and a tiny little grater, like a tiny cheese grater, so that you could grate up your snuff on the spot. Later on, you're buying, pre-grated snuff. But in the early days, you would have your kind of gold and diamond encrusted little grater as well. So there was this whole little set of objects that went along with it, all of which were very fancy. And then things shift really in the early 1700s. And what happens in the early 1700s is the British capture a Spanish snuff fleet. So not one boat, but a full fleet. And in doing that, then they massively increase the amount of snuff which is available in the British market. So that's when it really has a change from being a very, very expensive, high-status object to being something which is much cheaper and therefore available to ordinary people. And so the status and how people think of snuff in Britain shifts quite dramatically. So there's very different perceptions of snuff in different countries in Europe and different religious groups. So Pope Urban ordered that anyone found guilty of taking snuff in church should be excommunicated. Tsar Michael I went a bit further and said that snuff takers' noses should be cut off, which feels quite hardline.
That's a bit bold.
It is bold, but you're the Tsar. You're the great ruler. You can do what you want, but it does feel a little bit much. But having said that, actually sometimes snuff taking was looked on more favourably because in very religious countries, particularly in Catholic countries, smoking tobacco was seen as particularly problematic. Anything involving fire had mental associations with the devil, with hell, with sin, things like that. So actually, typically snuff taking was more popular in Catholic countries. So Italy, Spain and Ireland, and smoking cigarettes was more common, or smoking tobacco initially, but then later cigarettes is more common in Protestant countries like England and the Netherlands. So it's not obviously 100% across the board, but there does seem to be a bit of a division based on religion. So in terms of the medical side of things, again, we've talked about this, we've touched on this already, but a lot of ideas around disease are attributed to this idea that there was something inherently bad in the air. There was a miasma or some sort of bad air that you were inhaling. And we've mentioned that previously when we've talked about plague doctors and breathing through the plague mask, breathing through the herbs that were in the plague mask. So anything that stops bad smells getting into your body has a medicinal purpose in this logic. So snuff, in that way, acted like incense, it acted like a perfumed handkerchief or a potpourri. It was something that stopped that bad air getting into you. And so it was seen as having a medical benefit. And once you enter the real height of quackery, which is the 18th century, then snuff starts being advertised for many, many different diseases. So allegedly, snuff can treat hearing loss, headaches, insomnia, hysteria, paralysis. I found one advert that said, quote, "It cures complaints of the head that painters are subject to." I'm not even sure what that disease is, but it cures headaches, amongst other things. So it's being treated as a cure-all. They do love a cure-all. And it's then later on in the 18th century that you have John Hill, who's an English author and a botanist, pointing out that nasal cancer can develop with the use of snuff. So that's when the real shift starts to happen. But it's not a quick shift. Snuff and tobacco more generally, of course, continues to be used for a long time. So 100 years after that, in the 19th century, you can still find articles that kind of extol the virtues or the medical virtues of snuff. So there's one from The Gentlewoman magazine, which declared that by taking snuff, quote, "Many eminent people have cured themselves so that they could read without spectacles after having worn them for many years." So yes, it can even improve your eyesight taking some snuff. What can't it do?
What?
It seems like a real stretch. And we're in the 19th century by this point, so we're not even in a sort of earlier period of the more mystical medicine that Charlotte's talked about. It seems like a stretch, doesn't it?
Yeah. It seems like I want this to be the reason.
Yeah. I want to take snuff, and here is a list of reasons why I've decided that that's okay.
Yep.
But it's something we've definitely talked about before, but it's always interesting to see how the peaks and troughs of both what something is viewed as being in a social class sense, but also in terms of the medical sort of ideas around it, how connected that is to how available it is and what it costs. You know, if it's medically useful or not is very connected to whether, you know, if you're a poor person can get their hands on it or not. Thank you for listening to this Physicians Gallery podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, click like, or leave a positive review or comment. We truly appreciate your support because it helps us reach more people. If you'd like to know more about the Physicians Gallery, our exhibitions and upcoming events, please check out our website and social media pages. Links are in the description for this episode. Thank you.